So were the Uttarakhand floods of 2013 a one-off incident, a cataclysmic biblical event that will not happen again? I don't think so. The floods are something that can happen time and again, will happen again in another 5, 10 or 20 years. And the reasons behind the floods need to be studied at this point in time so we can minimize damage in future potential cloudburst and flood events. Undoubtedly, the Uttarakhand floods of 2013 have been the worst calamity, the worst disaster and tragedy to hit the Himalaya, possibly all of India, in the last few hundred years of recorded history. The scale and magnitude of the destruction and loss, human life, wildlife, the natural environment, mountain slopes, riverine systems, it's been enormous. The amount of loss has been tremendous. Is it going to happen again? Beyond doubt it will. So the Uttarakhand floods are not a one-off cataclysmic biblical scale event that have taken place. They are going to be a recurring motif in the Himalaya, which the Himalaya as it is are a young and brash mountain range. The mountains of the Himalaya are still growing. They are in a growing phase. The Himalaya rises by a few centimeters or a few inches depending on where you are on an annual basis. So the mountains are still growing. There is a lot of dynamics and a lot of geographical, geological scale change that is taking place here. So the floods are not a one-off cataclysmic biblical level event. They are going to happen again and again. Yes, partially man-made factors, human factors, disturbance of the environment, other factors will come into play. So the Uttarakhand floods, I would say, are 50% human created and 50% natural. The fact that the Himalaya are a growing mountain range means that the bedrock, the mountains, the rivers, everything is in constant change, although at a minute level every year, but there is growth, there is change taking place on a geological scale constantly. So when you have an event like the Uttarakhand floods that take place, it makes us rethink, it sets us back from our normal pace of what we call growth and development, and it forces us to take a relook at the way development is taking place in the Himalayan states of India and possibly Nepal as well. One of the factors which I hold responsible is the fact that when you really look back at development work in the Himalaya, construction, human activity over the last 200 years, most of the old British developments were in the form of hill station towns that were centered and located on ridges of the Himalaya, and these were least affected by the floods and possibly will only be affected by the big earthquake when it comes, because the entire Himalayan range is also sitting on a very active seismic zone. It comprises of a very active seismic zone. So you are going to see a big tremor in the next few years, a big trembler in the next few years in the Himalaya, and that combined with the likelihood of another big flood event in the Himalaya should force us to rethink the way we develop the mountains, the way we develop human activity and hill station towns and pilgrimage locations in the Himalaya. One of the reasons so much damage took place in these floods was that since independence, since 1947, when India started making her own decisions in terms of development, or when activity just happened and burgeoned on its own at its own pace, we will find that the old hill station towns were all located on the ridges, which is why there was no damage this time around in the hill station towns of Mussoorie, Nainital, Shimla, or any of the other towns made by the British. All the damage happened along the river valleys of the Ganga and the Yamuna, the tributaries of the Ganges as well, because in the last 50 years we've built roads up to the temple towns of Badrinath, Kedarnath, Yamunotri and Gangotri. These were never motorable in the past. 50 or 100 years ago, pilgrims used to make their way up to the higher shrines, temples and other pilgrimage locations in the Himalaya on foot. And in recent times we have built motor roads to all these locations. Those motor roads are subject to landslides, rockfalls, floods and various events that are natural in nature. And as a result of these roads having been built up to these temple shrines in the Himalaya, most of the development that we've seen in the last 50 years in India in the form of guest houses, shops, hotels, houses, temples have all taken place along the river valleys, as those rivers have had their roads follow them up to Badrinath, Kedarnath via Joshimath and the towns of Srinagar, Gupt, Kashi, up from Rishikesh and Hardwar, places where we've seen maximum damage in the floods of 2013. So most of the damage has happened along the river valleys because we've simply left maybe 5 meters or 4 meters above the river level to build these shops and commercial establishments, all of which have happened in a very unplanned and ad hoc fashion. So there's been no master plan for development in the Himalaya per se. As a result, when the river swelled up 20, 30, 40, even 50 feet in places, all those establishments, be they shops, guest houses, or simple tenements, hotels, temples, people's homes, were all swept away by the floods. So this is all a result of rampant construction and development activity without a planned framework that we've seen over the last 50 years. So this flood is not a one-off. It's an event that was very much in the making all these years and will happen once again. We had extensive floods last year, but they did not receive the kind of publicity that this 2013 event has received, simply because they weren't that destructive. So are we only going to judge a flood by its level of destruction, or are we going to actually look back and say, okay, now how can we prepare a better developmental template for the Himalaya based on potential seismic, earthquake risks and dangers, flood damage, potential river rise overnight due to cloud bursts. There are, after all, numerous lakes situated at all the glaciers of the Himalaya. Gohana Tal was an incident that took place historically when it burst overnight and a number of villages downstream were flooded, when the Birehi Ganga brought down a huge mass of water overnight. And even the Kedarnath incident in the current instance happened as a result of Chorabari Tal above Kedarnath temple having burst its banks in that torrential rain that took place overnight. So we need to really learn from this incident and create a larger developmental template for the Himalaya, so we can prevent such damage from happening in the near future. So while we are doing relief and rehabilitation and compensating the victims of the loss from this incident, as much energy needs to go into creating a larger template for the environment, tourism, where and how tourism should develop in the future, how roads should be built, where they should be built till, how we should allow hospitality in its current ad hoc disorganized form to come up along the pilgrim trail, along tourist spots on that pilgrim trail. So how many rooms and hotels are you going to allow at places like Gaurikund or Rambada on the route to Kedarnath, or around Badrinath, or short and before Gangotri along the Ganga Valley in Harsil, Lanka, Mukba, places like that, or even along the Yamuna Valley. And this needs to be looked at a much larger geographical scale. We need to look at the entire Himalaya from Kashmir to Arunachal Pradesh to see how we can prevent future potential seismic events from damaging the lives, livelihood and the natural environment of the Himalaya.